become these
Exactly.
huge kind of corporate interests that like,
We're live, but we can keep talking. Keep going.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's a corporate
Yeah,
interest. Keep going.
right. But just these corporate interests that like, again, these are real sort of community based subversive things that we were forced to do. We were forced to come together, pay for people funeral service. We were forced to come together, churches and mutual aid groups and benefit societies, um, to
The
like help
susu.
our community. Right. The SUS, right. To help
Yeah.
each other. But then they become, cogs in capitalism. They become these things, these corporate interests that like, kind of waters it down a little bit, you know?
I mean, I don't think it's the watering. It's kind of like the dispersal, right? So if you think
Mhm.
about capitalism as an economic phenomena that globalized itself during the transatlantic slave trade, right?
Right.
For a while, India was dependent on the cotton. Slave owners in the United
Mhm.
States had plantations in India and New Zealand, right?
Mhm.
So this is the connection of the enslavement of the indigenous and the displacement of the indigenous in order to corporatize resources, and then through that corporate resource exaggerate the actual
Mhm.
separation between man and nature, so
Mhm.
that way you end up not having control of any resources, and you end up in situations eventually in human history like what we had in COVID, right? The
Mhm.
shelves weren't empty because the product pipeline broke down. The
Mhm.
shelves were largely empty because corporations decided that because of the lockdown they weren't going to supply,
Right. Right. We're gonna force prices
or
up.
or not having access to masks. Like why was it so hard to get the things we needed, gloves, masks? Well, it's
Mhm.
because our medical system is corporatized, and
Mhm.
so they only have enough for the demand.
Right.
And because they only have enough for a demand, they only have enough for so it's these
Mhm.
kinds of dynamics that, because the way we're taught history, especially throughout the Americas, makes this like very clean and erroneous ahistorical separation between
Right.
what we're living then and what we're living now. Like,
Yeah. I
I
mean, but
yelled at
that's how they benefit. That's definitely how they benefit, because all of these
exactly.
things are cyclical. Like all of the things, all of the conversations we're having today, we've had, you know,
Yes.
which, and it's because of that, like you say, that sort of separation from history, like our very beings being like cut off from um you know things that we had been through. Like I have the same sort of conversations now with like my parents, with
Mm.
my grandparents, at the time when they were alive. But like,
Hmm.
it's it's so interesting. Like, but do think we are getting to an interesting place like here, because certain things are unsustainable. Certain things look phony in the light, and it's going to be interesting. I think the next couple years to kind of have conversations around, whether it be the globalization of kind of our labor and indigenous labor, black labor, capitalism, and also things like representation, things like what side are you on in terms of a genocide?
I mean, I think I go over this with my students a lot. I teach art history, so I'm constantly trying to show them how the aesthetic world that we live in is tied directly to aesthetics of citizenship, right? Which
Mhm.
are exclusionary and based on verisimilitude or what's recognizable,
Right.
because that's the aesthetic viewpoint of the moment where, Europe as a historical landscape began to leave its site en masse and see other places in the world, and everything ended up being categorized according to this already practiced aesthetic based in Christianity,
Mhm.
based in, like mass European warfare, based
Mhm.
in establishing the other, based in rhetorics that people in Western Europe took from antiquity sources, Greece and Rome. Like, oh,
Right.
this to be in a polis means you dress alike, you act alike. It's some form of what we would call today fascism, right?
Mhm.
This verisimilitude across people. But most places in the world practice relationality. Like, how do I relate to you in this moment and in this space as a context? And what are the rituals we're going to take on to kind of recognize each other and think about a dynamic rather than a rejection based on a lack of similarity, right? It's like Audre Lorde wrote about this quite a bit. And so, you know, when I explain it and kind of draw it out and give the visual examples and show maps, you know, my art history students are like, I thought it was just an academic discipline, and I'm like, no, it's a project.
Right.
It's a massive project, and it's in our literature. You know, like we have a lot of work to do, but I think that one thing that helps me in the moment is talking to friends, like you say, when you like get with, you know, the homies and you have those deep conversations, right? You like politicize yourself with people that you love. And I think the other good thing too is that you can actually see people learning on social media platforms. And I know the algorithm shapes some of this, but I think that it's like it's jumping across people's algorithm because the information and the sources are readily at hand through the posts that people do virally and the posts that become viral. So even a person that's already searching for a way to be treated preferentially, like in white supremacy, is going to encounter the Nell Irvin Painter book, The History of White People, and of course be drawn to it, but then be like, these are things I didn't know. So I think that's happening more rapidly, but I guess my question is it going to happen fast enough?
I mean, if you believe in acceleration theory or something, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's a great question. I'm certainly, again, like interested to see, you know, the kind of conversation we're having, um, you know, 2 years from now, when we're past the election, when we're past kind of these current moments, and there will be new moments, but how we kind of focus the conversation around, you know, what is, you know, building toward the system, or what is actual liberation, or what is actual revolution, or what is actually considered radical. I think those conversations are going to be especially interesting. And it was like we had a moment. We had, you know, in the wake of George Floyd. I mean, of course, it's a very shallow and hollow now. You know, like that 2020 moment of this kind of renewed interest in kind of Black life, and then that kind of like sizzled away, and we're like right back to the same sort of static kind of how can we feed the system rather than how can we, you know, because you had people considering abolition, or considering abolish the police, or considering these things, like, you know, you had whole police departments emptied out and fired, um and again, like, these things ended up being kind of hollow, but those conversations, I'm interested to see if they reignite, hopefully. And I think that goes to like kind of what we're talking about, like how fast will that happen. I don't know.
And also like become connected. I think that we have these moments where we are together, like we have those moments you're talking about, but then there's something that happens where we can't connect it to something else, or it's not connected quickly enough, right? It's hard to explain to an individual that's really focused on their everyday survival, that doesn't have the time or the emotional space to get them to internalize the reality that the theater of violence here is connected to a fear drive that feeds capitalism, because you'll rely on what seems stable when you're in fear.
Right.
And if the theater that makes us feel like we are irrevocably opposed to one another based on race, gender, class, etc., continues, then we aren't able to kind of like read the interaction. It's really hard to accept. It's like, oh, you mean all of this is kind of staged? And it's like quite a bit of it is staged, and it doesn't mean that some of it isn't real. But when you draw it out of context and you isolate it, then it makes it look a certain way. You have to talk about incidents and how they're connected to get a true value of what we're doing and what's required for us to exercise the human right to be there for one another.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And
Um,
oh, sorry.
no, but this is what it's about. We were talking and I want to keep
Sorry.
going, but this
Right.
book is all about that, right? This book is
Mm-hmm.
about, it's about community, it's about coming together, it's about invisible corporatized forces that represent themselves and institutions and the erosion of that and the difficulty of like becoming. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about We Are a Haunting, which is a brilliant book. But first, I want to say good evening to the Augustonians. Welcome back to Lit Friday. If you're new to our program, my name's Jessica Lanay. I'm the curator and host of Lit Friday. Lit Friday is a virtual program from the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. We are live on the final Friday of every month, and we bring you conversations with writers and creators of the African diaspora. We discuss their most recent works and how they connect to current events, as you just saw. And this month, we welcome Tyriek White, novelist and musician, we're going to talk about, and also the author of, as I said, We Are a Haunting. That cover is Aaron Douglas? No, it's Romare Bearden. That's right.
Romero. Yeah. Yep. Uh.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. It was. And I kind of connected to his kind of working class, like his sort of connection to migration, right? And the sort of working class people of Charlotte, Pittsburgh, and also New York,
Mm,
where he spent a lot of his time. And he has this sort of thing, or this idea called the prevalence of ritual, which kind of resonated with me in my artistic process. A lot of his work depicts church black church processions and family dinners and farm work, or like the cover, this kind of uh, well, on the paperback is a bit smaller, but this kind of scene from this corner, you can see
mm,
a bridge in the back, but these kind of intimate uh, moments that connect us as communities, as peoples, to rituals, and rituals are the things we use to kind of sustain ourselves and live and organize and gather. Um, you know, for me, the church processions that he painted so well,
mm.
to me feel like when one of ours died, and we airbrush T-shirts, and we put candles out on lampposts or in the lobby of apartment buildings. These same kind of uh, rituals that we engage in. I found myself like writing into these things and leaning into these things, and it being a part of my artistic process. So I
And
think,
we don't
yeah.
talk about each other in past tense when we die.
Mm, right, right.
We don't. I've had it happen a few times when, people who aren't familiar with like Black culture and Black grief and our culture around it, they're
Hmm.
like, oh, is ask other people around me if we're talking about someone who's passed on in the present tense. It's like, oh, are they when are you going to see them next? And we're
Hmm.
always like, oh no, they passed. Like we sometimes we're in positions where we have to explain because we keep each other alive in recitation
Hmm. Right,
by
right.
saying the name, saying the
Evoking
roll
them,
call, and talking about one another.
right? Evoking them constantly. Pouring libation by libation. You know what I mean? Like all of
The
these things.
repass, yeah.
Right, the repast, like formally and informally. Um, all of these things I try to write toward and capture. Um, you know, for this book, and I hope continuously throughout my writing and creative career, just writing about working class folk, writing about um, people even consider in that sort of underclass, um, like black folk, brown folk, indigenous folk, and capturing that experience. And like you spoke on before, like, sometimes we're, just trying to get by and survive, and living out this day to day. Um, what I think was so, wonderful, or what I tried to do in this book was to sort of follow that, but also how political and how politically charged our lives are, and how
Hmm.
in just sort of living and navigating the world in these spaces that um, we are constantly confronted with, structural violence or state violence, and how do we build lives, and how do we build with each other out of that. So this really was an important thing that I wanted to kind of convey, and get to the heart of, at least,
Yeah. Let me read your bio, Tyreek. Just so
We-
everybody knows, we have to know about the accolades. You got to know where Tyreek's been. You got to know what he's achieved. Because as a writer and a musician, he's an educator in Brooklyn, New York. He's the author of this beautiful book that he told us about the cover. He won the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. That's how this got published, right? In a partnership with Astra House, which is a subsidiary of Penguin.
uh Penguin, so Penguin distributes, right?
Okay, Penguin distributes, just for those writers out there to let you know how it works, and was longlisted for the Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize as well. He's received fellowships from Callaloo and New York State Writers Institute, among other honors. He is currently the media director of Lampblack Literary Foundation, which seeks to provide mutual aid and various resources to Black writers across the diaspora. You can follow Tyreek on Twitter or IG at Native Mind State. And you can also follow me to keep up with my curatorial projects writing and Lit Fridays at @hanginthere_kitty on Instagram as well. I wanna so Callaloo, I went to Brown, I went to Callaloo as well. So
Oh, word.
we're workshop siblings.
Oh,
Awesome.
oh, oh. What year, if you don't mind me?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, you don't have, I was there in 2016, and
Okay, so I think we very likely were there together. You went to Brown, right?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. I
yeah.
think we were very, very likely there together because I
Wow.
remember doing Callaloo
Mm-hmm.
while I was finishing out like my second year, I think, of Cave Khanum, and by that time I
Oh,
was in
okay.
the MFA. So we were
Oh,
actually together at the same time, but I was
nice.
in the poetry section.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I listen. I was with the poets, 100%. So we definitely probably crossed paths, of course.
No,
Um,
I was thinking that. I was like, every time I kind of like was posting about it, about the conversation, I was like,
mhm.
I think I know him. Like, I think I've seen him before.
Right.
So one of the things I want to talk about specifically when it comes to We Are a Haunting is time. I think one
Mm,
of my favorite parts of this is that you give us T, the mother of Kali, one of the protagonists, but
mm,
we get her in her early 20s and we get him in his teen years. And I've never seen that kind of juxtaposition together. Because I think so often when we have a protagonist that's young and the
mhm,
parents represented, we're used to seeing the parent parenting, but we get so much more out of who they are and how they inform one another. And in Kali's conversation with Key, even after um, he can't speak to her in person. So I wanted to talk about that structure of time and why put the youthful versions of this family together. What did that do for you as a writer?
Um, for me, it kind of, and I'm glad you like pointed it out, like that conversation, because I do consider the book this huge conversation across realms and liminal lines and all of that. But I wanted to, so with Kali, it initially sort of started um, with kind of like me wanting to write this typical buildings roman kind of coming of age story about a young
Mm,
kid growing up in public housing in Brooklyn. Um, and of course, that story grew and grew and grew. But I found it interesting because Key's voice, his mom came to me, sort of as a young adult, as like this sort of young 20 something, just kind of, she's like boosting clothes from her department store job. She's like, going to the basketball games at night, chilling, like she lives a very grounded kind of life, especially for a young adult growing up in like the 80s, early 90s. And for me, I thought that was so interesting because I just wanted to capture that time because um, I was born in 91, but my all of my older brothers, my older sister, are like, 80s babies. They grew up in that time, and you know, I kind of I kind of really love that time. Just you know, watching Paid in Full, watching like, all the Juice and New Jack City, all of those those movies from that time period, and that vibe and the music.
New Jack City and Crooklyn are two of my favorite films.
Yeah, Crooklyn's in
Crooklyn.
there. So many, so many. But I just love that time, and I wanted to write about it. And I thought it was interesting to kind of mirror these kind of coming of age stories of, this kid in like the 2000s that
Mm-hmm.
more accurately reflects, like, the time I know, versus this coming of age, albeit a bit older, but still in those formative, like, this is what the rest of my life is going to be, years. And kind of like seeing like what can Kali learn from Key as he enters that, and also um what she's sort of passing on, and she doesn't even, without spoiling much, um she doesn't realize what she's passing on, but she's passing on something in the moment, and what that's like as a young person. um so I was really interested in that kind of dynamic.
I think one of the things that that juxtaposition of the two of them do for me is I was able to receive the characters as kind of alternate universes of one another.
Mm,
And
mm-hmm,
there was something about them being kind of around the same age in their speaking throughout the book that really helped me as a reader accept the different parallel time scales that you were working with.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so there's the time of the ancestors, there's
Right.
the time of contact with them, there's communal time, and you
Mm-hmm,
constantly see Kali and his best friend Zaire kind of
mm-hmm,
jumping in and out of time scales.
mm-hmm.
Like time is really a form of intimacy here.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I didn't want, I'm already, you know, the kind of greats, the Tonys, the Octavias, all of these writers kind of bucked against, kind of Western ideas or impositions of time.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately I wanted to reject that. Immediately, um, the experience of being young black in these communities or isn't a linear being black in America isn't a linear kind of thing, but
Yeah.
specifically these kind of people, it didn't feel linear. You talk about a community that I'm writing about, but that reflects other poor working class communities all over America and all over the world, honestly. But on the outskirts of these giant empires, East New York, the community I'm writing about is on the outskirts of considered, New York City, even though it's in Brooklyn, even though the outer boroughs are New York City, we're
Mm-hmm.
still kind of all looking toward Manhattan or the Empire, right? Um, like a lot of communities throughout this this nation, it's they're organized away from these resources, usually surrounded by factories, usually surrounded by um, dated kind of you know, so like heating stations and sewage plants and all of these, abandoned warehouses. I read an article about my neighborhood. I read several articles, and um, a lot of them described this place as being landlocked, or I mean, time locked. These
Mm-hmm.
places like stuck in time, like it's the new millennium, but like a lot of the times it felt like it's the 90s. And these are like, articles, and this is what I felt, growing up. So I kind of wanted to capture um, that essence of this place, kind of. pushed to the side, pushed to the outskirts, away from the center, of time, kind of, right? And kind of what that feels like, what it feels like to, be transported, or like walk streets and blocks that are named after, slave owners, or people who used to occupy this land, and might have enslaved your ancestors. What is that psychic experience like, moving through that world? um so yeah, so a lot of it was all about kind of how does the body feel, how does the conscious and the body kind of move in these fragmented moments where, um either, you're trying to, move forward, you're trying to progress, right? Whatever that means, you're trying to figure out what that means, what that's supposed to mean. Meanwhile, the world around you is kind of warping, and there's a way people view you, and there's a way people view where you come from, that is rooted in a certain history, right? Like suddenly everyone, like we were saying, suddenly everyone gets amnesia when we're talking about, um, liberation, and this, you know conversations we've had since the Panthers, and all of these things. But we black folk are always looked at as this product of this historical process, which is the transatlantic slave trade.
Mhm.
Um, and I
And
think,
then the making invisible of it, right? Like even
right.
currently in education system, the erasure of any kind of critical education about it helps people continue with the amnesia, and
Hmm.
also helps white people to continue considering their citizenship privileges,
Right.
their privilege as
Right.
anything other than like a diamond collar on their humanity.
Mm.
Their humanity cannot even be fulfilled through whiteness, but they're
Right.
given so many privileges in the
Hmm.
performance of the inhuman that without the discussion of how that came about, there's no inroad to them to even to discover, right? What
Hmm.
complicity, what being complicit really means, right?
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes whether or not people are complicit has so much to do with being um, presented extremely limited options that don't give them the opportunity to even realize they are.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I tried to like write into that, like, what is that, what is just the experience of living through that. um
It's very intricate. Like this book is like, I kept thinking of a spider's web and how that's constructed. It's like you have a star and then you go around and you go around, and each time it's a different location because time is space,
Hmm.
but you keep seeing reflections and visitations. And it's interesting to see how toward the end, the emptying out of the neighborhood that you are writing the biography of through people,
Hmm.
right? Fictional biographies, but there that's the fiction is the biographies of your characters.
Hmm.
Um, how as people transform, the earth that they're on also transform. And I wanted you to kind of get into like that parallelism between the character development and
Hmm.
the environmental development. It's a real difficult task as a writer to show land, right, as it's
Right.
having its own narrative, and being very clear about ways that you demonstrate how that development of the land or the architecture directly affects the development of the people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and first it's identifying the link between the two, right? Between the people and what's happening to the land. um I grew up, with these old like myths and stories and folklore of my community, right? And how, the mob used to bury people in the marshlands, uh how, like, cops used to, pick up people and drive to the edge of the swamps, technically, and just dump them and let them find their way back. um these things have always been kind of circulating in my head. And I think coming down south, being in the South, being in Mississippi, made me pay attention to the land in a different way that I might not have if I'd written this book, front and center in New York. Um, so the transformation of the land became super important to me, and kind of the connection of displacement, the history of displacement that we have, um, start from white flight to gentrification now. But for this community and for other communities, it's a real interesting, because it's not that clean cut. It's not that easy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, I kind of wanted to kind of bring it into this kind of speculative realm. Because at the end, it's kind of this apocalyptic kind of feel. There's flooding in the buildings. There's all these things. There's this deterioration that's happening, and um, of course, it reflects these kind of cycles of white flight to gentrification to now reverse white flight, um, but also kind of what we do to uh, the land itself. My neighborhood, or the neighborhood in this book as well, is surrounded by marshland. It used to be swamps back in the day. It's
Mm-hmm.
on the bay. It opens out into the Atlantic Ocean. Um, so there are all these kind of natural elements that kind of wanted to tie together in this really nuanced way. And by the end, I just wanted to push it as far as I could. Um, and what's ironic is that, um, you kind of take a stroll through my neighborhood now. Like some of it, there um, some public realty group has kind of bought into. So public housing now, a lot of it is public and private. So it's not just
Mm.
state, because
It's
NYCHA was
mixed income housing.
right. NYCHA was like billions and billions of dollars in debt. So you have a lot of these older kind of projects being bought up. Um, so mine has been bought up recently, and like they're doing renovations and all this stuff. But some of it, one block looks like a Call of Duty map. It's just, you know, uh, just the earth is pulled up. There's all these shipping containers. It's
Mm-hmm.
all of this construction being done. So it's kind of like walking through it is like, did I write this into existence? Kind of like, you know, I wanted to exaggerate, but it's like even in the kind of exaggeration that we do in our lives, it's being black again. I come back to this being black in this country, the idiosyncrasies of it. It kind of it sort of writes itself. Um,
But it also isolates like your narrative of the geography and the architecture and the massive development of it and then the gross underdevelopment of it reveals to the reader in a real life kind of way how capitalism really drives itself on creating avoidable disasters for people, for BIPOC communities.
mm,
It creates avoidable disasters, and one of the examples of that is what you're talking about is NYCHA housing,
right.
where all of that land is owned, right, by the abstract bureaucracy that says it sits on the
Hmm.
land, right?
Hmm.
But then for developers, they wait until it's reached its worst point in
Hmm.
order to begin to dispossess and disenfranchise those people that cannot participate in society through owning property,
Right.
which is a hard continuity from slavery itself. When a lot of Black people after emancipation were not, they were promised land, like 40 acres and a mule, but
Hmm.
most of us got nothing to prevent us from being able to vote because you had to be a property owner,
Right.
which is still a form of enslavement. And
Right.
so I think that the other aspect of the narrative of the natural world is how the water in the novel goes from the dream states and starts
Mm-hmm.
to seep through the walls
Mm.
of the homes. It's
Hmm.
like you begin to talk about that suffocation
Right.
and how suffocating water is despite it being liquid oxygen, right?
Right.
And how it just ends up coming through the walls. Like what is water here? And it just seems like it's just like the community is almost like a sinking vessel. Like,
Hmm. I mean, yeah, it kind of, you put it extremely, you put it way better than I, but it's it is that sort of, you reach this point in the book, in the story, where it's like, all of these things are kind of coming and rushing and flooding, um and pushing people out, and this is the reason, this is the representation of kind of the reasons that we have, but we don't have the language for. um Water could be, because water for me started location, of course, but then it started, Song of Solomon. This
mm,
The narrative of, the slaves who, uh took back control of the slave ship, and, you know killed the captain and the crew, and then flew back to Africa. These it began in those folklores, um, and then it grew into sort of how this water connects our diasporic experience. New York, like other major cities, of course, but New York in particular has a certain, um, there's a proximity to all types of people from the Caribbean, Haiti, parts of Africa. I didn't meet another African American until I was probably in, like, uh, middle school or high school. Like, all my
mm,
friends are, you know, from Barbados, from Jamaica. So my uh, my relationship to blackness has always been this diasporic one, um, and how do we bring sort of these folklores, the religious practices that are kind of built into, um, the myth of this story, that, um, kind of the objects and the ghosts. There's a mythology
mm,
that a lot of the ghosts and stuff is built off, and it's kind of the Yoruba, and these spiritual practices that traveled to, Haiti, and became, Voodoo, and became Santeria in, Cuba and Puerto Rico. So following this kind of trail, this lineage, um, and the central kind of movement of it being literally the water, being people traveling across these places.
mhm,
Um, Water just kind of, I don't know, it just filled the story. It just um, more than kind of like the African American writer inclination to kind of use water as this symbolism. For me, it
mhm,
was inextricable, or I couldn't really separate it from how a lot of the ideas and aesthetics were brought to this place. Um, so I think it was vital. Um, and again, I love what you said about how water plays a part in, from the beginning to the end, and what it does in the end. Um,
I mean, water kind of foretells, right here. Like, water gives us a sense of what's happening next, and it's a signpost in the book, whether or not it's raining softly, whether or not there's water or this boundary line in the dream state. And
mm,
it's such an intuitive gesture that we are able to recycle and learn from our own artistic production, because if we think about our history of what remains with us based on where we're from, we've
mm,
always considered water to be that line between ancestor and the physical.
mm,
And you
mm-hmm,
can find it in Ghana, you can find it in Nigeria, Togo, Benin, you can find it in the Congo and the
right.
DRC, and you find it in Angola. And the indigenous spiritualities, what is maintained across all of that long history of Bantu migration,
Mm-hmm,
is that aspect of the transition from the physical to the ancestor, and water or the fluid being a major symbolism. So
right.
there's also like a strong intuition
Yeah.
here in this book that reveals itself And it's something I'm going to have trouble articulating because I haven't seen it before. So there's a part of We Are a Haunting that really represents what remains of how people are able to explain their spiritual continuity
Mm.
across Cuban culture, Bahamian culture, Bayesian culture, Jamaican culture, Puerto Rican culture,
Right.
like all these different kinds of people who in our everyday life we probably argue, on the corner about you ain't this, you ain't that, you didn't do
Right.
whatever, like our little competition or whatever. But we
Mm.
still recognize one another through those spiritual things. But here it's not a foil, it's not a tool. It's something that everybody understands and admits that there's a natural language for.
Mm.
And so, more than a lot of things I read, it rests here not as something that's like all decorated in the back to make a point. It's just how people live.
Mhm.
And I wanted to know how you got to taking out the exotification of the way we think about time and spirituality, and what your tactics were as a writer at making it critically real to understanding where these people are and what their lives are like.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's such a good question. I'd like to start with intent, right? Because my intent was, I'm gonna just tell you, it was very basic. It was very like, yo, what if like a seer or like a psychic just lived in the hood and we just like, it really kind of
I
grew
mean,
out.
we do.
Right, right, and but
So often.
that's the point. Like we actually do. And so it was really about building kind of around that, right? And writing with the kind of um conviction or the kind of straightforwardness that just it's sort of matter of fact. It's sort of um you know a lot of the kind of, again, the structural violences and the day to day, I think, is so, again, grounded, but also like, very conversational, very straightforward, that it's, and then the language that this world is sort of written in, you kind of can't tell which foot you have in this world versus what foot you have in this world. Like it's all sort of blended together, but you still get the very kind of authentic experiences of people, engaging in community, the same tensions, the same arguments, the same, laughter, the same, you know, um, kind of galvanizing around um, certain events or milestones in people's lives. All of these things are kept very, like true to, Black life, Indigenous life, or working class life. Um, that I think those elements kind of just become a part of, who these people are. Like Key is, it, and her process of discovering of what this is, what this gift or curse is, what she's experiencing, and making sense of that. Um, she begins to learn. She begins to like do, research. Research is a strong word, but she's sort of taught these things by her own sort of what would you call it, spiritual guide, or so when Kali kind of is exposed to these, um, he thinks he's seeing his mom. He thinks he's hearing her voice emanating from this object, and he goes to um, see this person in his community that um, has this inner knowledge, and then kind of flipping the script on who gets to have and contain this inner knowledge. For Kali, it's someone everyone around the community calls a dust head or crackhead, you
Mm.
know, but making her this kind of, you know, this person with this insight toward the spiritual world or whatever, without this kind of kooky, like, she's very sober in these moments, and other moments as well. Um, I think that kind of subverts what people think of uh, when they think of getting help from someone, or when they think of being in prayer, or think of in community with someone. Like, Kali actively seeks the most vulnerable person in his community, arguably, um, for advice and spiritual guidance, and like to tell him like this is what's going on. Um, so I think it's a combination of those things. I hope I kind of kind
No,
of
no,
answered.
you mentioned the object. I love Kali, right? Because Kali is like very real to me in terms of very kind of like young, quiet, but yet still bombastic. Like, I don't give a F. Like, like it's my favorite part of when he goes on adventures, whether they're emotional or physical. He's like down for the ride.
Mm,
Um, and in this sense, you mentioned the object he had, which is an Nkisi, which is a power figure
mm,
that is found is broadly around like Central Africa.
yeah.
Um, and but that's not the only thing. There are quotes from Tony K. Bambara. There's a mention of Sarah Ahmed. There's Yinka Shinobare that's in there. There's a lot of artistic legacy that springs up in the book, and it's so fresh. I see Gabriel Garcia Marquez here. I see Nalo Hopkinson here, particularly Black Girl in the Ring. I see um, Temple of My Familiar from Alice Walker. I see so much cross genre, inter-genre influence. And it was like Easter eggs throughout the book whenever a piece of art or literature kind of popped up on the
Mm,
bookshelf or in the museum that I
mm,
loved engaging with. So, going off of that, why is that there for you as a writer? And
mm.
how is it reflective of who your influences are?
Yeah, I love that question. Um, well, right, starting from the object in Kissy, this art object that's endued with this sort of spiritual energy. I mean, Kali thinks he's losing his mind, but
Mm-hmm.
and I think that right there kind of captures, this art object, right? This Western art object, but where it's originally comes from, and had purpose, it had use. And I think that's a conversation that's had throughout the book of whether art for art's sake versus, you know, um, kind of indigenous ideas of art as being like these things we use, and these things that are important to kind of our everyday life, whether actual physical kind of, again, use, or like ritual or prayer around. So right there, that conversation, there's tension. Um, I hate the kind of art for art's sake kind of CIA plot to kind of sanitize art in America from having these kind of social or political aims. Um, and this book kind of grapples with that a lot, and also just as Black art, like, kind of grapples with, again, going back to the day to day, the people I'm writing about, the what is that like? You're trying to survive, right? You're trying to pay your bills. You're trying to, so what is art
Mm-hmm.
have, like, what kind of effect does it have on my life when I might not make next month's rent? And I
Ah,
think I try to interrogate that as to we consume art, even at a level that we might not consider. I bring, the music in the story for me is super important because I try to bring it up to the level of, and put it in conversation with Sarah Ahmed and Adrian Piper, and and it's not, it doesn't take much, elevation, because to me these things are just as vital and important as these things over here. So the whole book was a lot of questions I had, and me trying to answer them. also just my aesthetic, the shit I like, you know, all the music and theory and art that I've like soaked up over the years, um, and linking this work with those traditions, with a tradition of some parts of Black womanism,
Mm-hmm.
and aspects of kind of with Stuart Hall identified as like uh, objects of representation, and like and like what is what is being represented, um, but then also pulling up how um, this Redman song samples this um, Mary Jane Girls vibe from
Mm.
back in the day, and how this is an example of intertextuality. And it was a constant kind of push to kind of make sense of my own sort of artistic inclination, why I need art so desperately. Um, and I tried to kind of deal with that um, in the day to day. That's why Kali kind of works in this museum, right? Or interns in this museum. Um, the proximity to art, like what is that conversation he has with a friend in the museum of I look at this when I feel this type of way, and like he's actually asking this friend like, well, what does this mean to like people who come from communities like ours? Like, what is it? It's not going to help. um and I think that's my favorite part about it. It's like grappling with that, seeing how we do seek out art, and maybe it's not the high art on the museum walls, but we we gravitate toward it, and it could be a gateway or a doorway into spirituality, into self reflection, into growth, into healing, all of these things. um, so yeah.
So I want to ask the question about you as a writer. What,
Sure.
because I think when people imagine writing, for some reason in our imagination, when you're a writer, there's this huge chasm between creating something and getting it published.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
And
yeah.
it seems like you have to make this humongous leap. Like, I finished the thing. Now I have to
Mhm.
make this gigantic leap somehow from
Right.
having finished it to getting someone to care enough about this thing I've done to publish it. And
Mm.
then you got to go through the process when you're successful of having someone be like, so tell us about your journey with that. How do you get from book to submission to prize? And what was the editorial process like for you, especially for something as interwebbed as We Are a Haunting?
Yeah, I think, man, I think I'd start from being true to your artistic vision and goal. Um, my agent read this manuscript over COVID, like, during the lockdown and stuff like that, and fell in love with how I talked about and wrote about New York, my New York.
Yeah.
Um, so I didn't shy away from, things I might have considered to be like super specific or like anything. I try not to compromise much, right? In the process, like, of course, things get changed around, and like decisions become more collaborative. Uh, but I think with the initial kind of manuscript, my advice would be to be unflinching in your vision. Of course, that doesn't mean like being rigid in advice or or how to make the thing better, but I guess that comes in considering who you should take advice from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay, so from there, I'd say the process was super. It's pretty long, like again,
So
this
let me
was
get it. Let me grip it. You wrote it, and then you sent it out to get it agented, and a part of the agenting process was a submission to the prize.
no, no. So the prize came after it was published.
Okay, okay, okay,
So
okay. Oh, understood. So there was no submission. It was something that was granted to you based on the. Understood. Okay.
Yeah, so when I sent out my my professor was able to get my manuscript to their agent.
Nice.
KSA Layman
Beautiful.
grew me the Dwayne Wade alley oop, and that's how it was able to get to my agent now. But we worked for like 2 years on it. I When I sent it, I didn't have an ending. I didn't have, I had a idea, but it wasn't written, and it took maybe 2 years to kind of, this was when everything was shut down, and we were trying to find the right time. We were trying to. It was a lot. I was going through it. I ain't gonna lie,
Mm.
because I just graduated. Um, I'm down where I don't have no family down here, no nothing, and I was on stamps. I was going through it. But I think when we finally kind of started shopping it around to editors, it became about um, it became about my kind of connection to the person who was going to be kind of like chopping shit, right? Chopping
Uh,
shit out of this piece. So you want to
uh-huh.
kind of have a good sense about uh, the person, the imprint, all of these things to be well informed. And sometimes it's just chemistry. It's like maybe you don't have chemistry with this person or something. And luckily, I had some pretty good options, but I think I went the route I went is because of my editor at the time came from a similar background as me, was Dominican, Puerto Rican as well, and like really got kind of the world I was trying to build, and not saying like you know racial. He was also grew up in public housing and was working class, so like he really kind of got everything about it. So I think that's why I went the direction I went at the time, and you know, for me, it was a great experience. Putting out a book, it was you know, the one thing I've wanted to do like my whole life. So for me, just kind of engaging with people, being able to do an event at my public library that I grew up down the street
Mm.
that actually shows up in the book,
Yeah.
that actually sits on the African burial ground I talk about in the book. Being able to like, do an event there and being able to you know, uh, talk to kids, to young people who um, come from similar places, and we don't really see like people that look like us, like who have a book or like have these things, or like when we do, they're like no offense to these, but they got the tie, they got the blazer, they got
We need to have a
kind of.
serious conversation about class privilege in the Black community that we have not yet had.
Listen, I'm ready.
You're ready.
I'm ready. Listen, I've been one to have that combo for a long time, but it's been beautiful, and to be kind of recognized for this work by the Brooklyn Public Library, by the Center for Fiction, by
Hmm.
the National Book Foundation. It's again, it's a dream, and to do it, writing about the communities and the people that I fuck with, and being unflinching in that is the cherry on top. So
I feel like once every like 10 to 15 years, we get like a 300 to 400 page book from a non BIPOC writer that's
mm,
about New York, that's
mm,
like this rambling, like cityscape.
mm,
And we have one for the 70s, we have one for the 80s, we have one for the 90s, 2000s coming to a bookstore near you, right? But
right.
at the same time, because of the privileged position of view, we get sketches of people, not
Mm,
necessarily fully fleshed out characters that can give the reader more information
right.
about the world that they're in and become more immersive
Hmm.
as trained restrictive viewpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this, I feel like, is that like 2000s historical fiction genre crossing sweep, right? That comes out every 10 to 15 years.
Thank you.
But it's coming from that perspective
Mm-hmm.
that really, really unveils and reveals the truth about New York. When I was toward the end of the novel, having lived in New York for 5 years, I
Mm-hmm.
was there during Sandy. So when you wrote about it, I was like, this is exactly how it was. I remember when they were first using resources to light up Manhattan. And,
Mm-hmm.
in lieu of anywhere else that needed water, that needed light, that needed help, that was flooding. And
Yep.
I remember holding hands with a complete stranger, another woman, and walking in the pitch black from Grand Central
Mm.
to Times Square
Wow.
because there was no train. And
Right.
I was reading that end of the book and I was like, this is the taste and the smell of that
Mm.
moment. So it's a lot of really good work that you've done here, and not that
Thank you.
one is
Thank you.
is one not that one is above the other, right? You can have a really critical, studied engagement, and then you can have a critically intuitive engagement. And
Right.
I think they both provide different things and are just as important. But I
Mm.
think you take a curiosity about the world that you're creating that kind of helps it unfurl. And
Sure.
and what I also appreciate about the characters is how real they are. There's no heroic arc here. There's no
Nope.
heroism. No one's getting saved. At the end of this, the work is left to be done. And in that
Mhm.
way, you really, really respect the characters that you're
Mhm.
engaging with.
Right. Yeah. That was important. That was I didn't want, because what, that's not real life. It's not real life. And hopefully, it didn't dampen like um kind of the mood, right? Of like, oh, this is depressing. Hopefully at the end, like you said, you're like, the work is still to be done and it's still being done. Um so yeah.
No, I think just like speaking from the perspective of a Black woman as a reader or a reader of yours, I feel like the sincerity with which sight is handled
Mm,
enabled me to get through the harder parts of the book because I was comforted by the idea, the
mm,
knowledge, the knowing, the acceptance that we are going to be together, if not here, then home.
mm, right.
And that helped me be able to stick with the characters despite how personal the precarity felt at times.
Mm, right. Right. Love that. Um there's that kind of, you know, a sort of reluctance to um kind of let these characters like be harmed, right? Like I
Yeah.
love these people. Like I don't want to do harm to them. I don't want to like, have them go through certain things. So yeah, I just that experience, right? Of just, having this intent, having, this care and love for these characters in this community, balancing that with like being authentic and real, for the structural kind of violence that like permeates. It's hard, it's tough, and I think that's the beauty of storytelling, just to kind of, you know intermingle all of these things, that curiosity you're talking about, that critique, um that investment that we have in these people, in these places, but to trouble it, to, collapse it and see, kind of what happens or what comes out of that, and the questions we have from that. So yeah.
So I want to thank you for your hard
Thank
work,
you.
and I can't wait to like read the next thing or hear the album when you're ready to make it and release it as well.
For sure, for sure.
Um, I really, yeah, this is great. And I'm really happy that I got to speak to you about it. And I know that
Thank
we're
you.
over time, Augustonians. I know we only have an hour, but let me tell you what's going on at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center, because if you're in Pittsburgh, you don't want to miss it. Tyreek, you may have to take a train because the Pittsburgh International Jazz Festival is happening from
So,
September 19th to September 22nd. We have Robert Glasper, Sema Funk, Average White Band, Howard Alexander, and so many more people coming to Pittsburgh to perform for you. You've got to go on awaacc.org, our website, and buy your tickets and make your reservations. Also on September 19th, we have our event Intermission, an artful networking series. And at these events at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center, we offer a beautiful evening out, opportunity to network and be in community. There's always excellent music, excellent food, excellent drinks, and also there's also excellent people. At the end of September, on Friday, the 27th, Lit Friday returns with a group reading from Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx writers from the LGBTQIA+2 community. We are going to have Malika Aisha, Jehoida Calvin, Louis Ortiz Fonesca, Tirza Shepherd, and Ivanoa Veras de Jesus. Join us for our reading. We're going to be reading from the anthology published by the University of Arizona Press, edited by the incredible poet, scholar, and interdisciplinary artist Alan Pelias Lopez. I'm not reading the pieces I have in the anthology. I'm just giving my anthology mates room to roam and share their
come
incredible
on.
work. So be with us on Friday, the 27th of September. Meet us at 6 p.m. Get your tickets for the Pittsburgh International Jazz Festival. And to kick it off, make sure you're there on September 19th at Intermission so you don't miss the good time. Again, follow Tyriek White on Twitter and Instagram at Native Mind State. Keep up with the projects, keep up with the readings. I'm sure there's more in store. And to keep up with me and Lit Friday, I'm on Instagram at hanginthere_kitty. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Thank y'all. Thanks, Tyreek.
Thank you. Thank you again. That was an incredible conversation. Thank you for holding space for me. Um, brilliant. Brilliant
We got to
job.
let people know the good news, as we say.
Yes. Yes.
Good night, everyone.